and welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink, and this is the fourth installment in our series After the Bomb, sci-fi movies of the 1950s. Today, we'll be discussing 1958's Fiend Without a Face.
The brain, it's gone.
That's not all. The entire spinal cord is missing.
But it's incredible.
It's as if some mental vampire were at work.
Does it come from another country or another world? This terrifying menace that G2 must destroy before it's too late.
Image is fading, sir.
There it goes again. Same trouble.
How can they stop this invisible force whose only warning is a weird, blood-chilling sound? Only two people still alive can help this agent find the answers. The girl who could be a spy, and the scientist who could be the destroyer of the entire human race.
We're facing a new form of life that nobody understands. I believe it feeds on the radiation from your atomic plants, and that it's evil.
Fiend Without a Face is a British 1958 sci-fi horror film directed by Arthur Crabtree and released by MGM. It tells the story of a mysterious death at the hand of a mentally created invisible life form that feeds on atomic power and then steals human brains and spinal columns to use as bodies in order to multiply its numbers. So, pretty conventional plot there, right?
Yeah. Pretty run-of-the-mill.
Run-of-the-mill, yeah. By the numbers.
Yeah. So I had never seen this one before. Jeremy, did you see this one, or
I had seen this one a while ago. It's probably been a good 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, you actually recommended this one,
mm-hmm.
And when you brought this one up to me when we were talking about different ones to do for the series, this kind of came up. It was sort of last minute. We were trying to figure out what our final 5 would be, and I just looked up the plot and I was like, that sounds perfect.
Yeah,
and also it seemed like a perfect and kind of genius, low-budget solution to making a monster movie, because the monsters are invisible. I just found that very, very kind of charming, and but although we'll get into this, but eventually in the movie, you do see something, and it is a hell of a something, and we'll talk about that.
Shocking.
Yeah, it really, like, I kind of knew it was coming, but when it did, it was like, wow.
Yeah.
And earlier in the series, we've dealt with monsters who have very little actual screen time, but I thought this actually took it to another level. I thought not only do we eventually see these monsters, but we see a lot of them, actually, like way more than I thought we would. Especially for another runtime that's pretty short. This movie is 1 hour and 14 minutes.
Which, compared to some of these other 50s sci-fi movies, is like, is behemothly long, but compared to most movies in general, we've seen.
Well, the last one, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, that was 1 hour and 5 minutes, I believe.
Yeah.
So. The first couple we talked about were average
normal,
hour and a half. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of in the middle there.
Yeah.
But I felt like it was a good length for this. Probably just the right amount, because it doesn't really overstay its welcome, but and it has like I said, plenty of thrilling moments throughout and a lot of special effects we'll get into. And this movie also seems to be pretty well revered, part of the Criterion Collection.
Yeah, which was surprising. Yeah,
it was surprising. I didn't realize that at first. But we were discussing before we started recording why that might be. Why this is maybe held in a higher regard. I mean, also Godzilla obviously is in the Criterion Collection, and that makes sense because it's very culturally and historically significant.
And also not a B movie in the same way some of these other films.
Yeah,
we've
I mean, I would call this movie straight up B material.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But the material is a little elevated. I would say it's a little more abstract than a lot of other monster movies. It's more psychological, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
It's dealing with things that are a little more hypothetical, or like there's almost a philosophy behind it. So I found that pretty interesting, and maybe it's that little bit different take and a little more high concept. Maybe that's why it's in the Criterion Collection, or why it's so highly regarded. It is quite different than any of the other monster movies that I've seen, at least.
Although certainly still a B movie. I'm looking at the poster here. I have it pulled up online, which I'm looking at it too. And then the tagline is "New Horrors, Mad Science." What is that word? I can't even read it because Spawns, evil friends,
evil fiends.
Evil fiends, yes.
Not friends.
Yeah, they maybe should have thrown a little bit more of a drop shadow on those words. Yeah, Spawn's evil friends. That's interesting. That's a different movie. But yeah, and then you know the picture on the poster of the girl wrapped in the towel, and it definitely was advertised as schlock, but I think something about it has this kind of elevated. We as we noted before, it is a British movie, so I think that there is almost. Kind of an intangible European quality to it. This doesn't feel like American schlock. It feels just a little more ideological. Not quite. Not that some of the American schlock movies don't have ideas mixed in, but it kind of feels like the ideas mixed into this one were maybe a little bit more intentionally there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we looked at Japanese with Godzilla, and then a couple of American ones, and I like that we're trying to get a little bit of a. Yeah, so now we're in the UK with this one. So just to go into the plot a little bit for this one. So it takes place almost entirely, actually, on an American Air Force base in Canada. So even though it's a UK production, it's American Air Force base in Canada. And it starts with a soldier taking a smoke break, and he hears something, which may be footsteps or something... much like the giant ants in Them, it was a sound unlike anything that you can really place or anything that I've really heard of. And I was at this point, I was like, I love this already. Like I was already into it. And then he hears a scream and finds another soldier laying dead, and that's when the titles come on screen. And again, just phenomenal titles in all these movies.
All of them, really, especially this was one of my favorites for sure.
Yeah, this was a great one.
Crazy looking title. Any graphic designer listeners out there, definitely worth looking at all of these movies for just their titles alone. You don't even have to get through every single one. Just watch the first 2 minutes and see this beautiful title design work.
For sure, yeah. And then so it comes out kind of out of nowhere, but I like that it was like a stinger on the end of that opening scene, and then from there we go into the officials on the base who are looking into what happened, and eventually, because not a spoiler because of what the series is, they assume that it's caused by radiation, and the radiation is from the base, correct, or is it immediately like right outside the base, or I believe from the actual base?
It's a little vague. It seemed like it was something having to do with the communication between the base and the planes, or something. It wasn't totally clear where the radiation was coming from.
Again, a little more abstract, this one. So, and then so eventually, the main characters we meet with the colonel and Barbara Grissel, and I guess her brother was the one who was killed in that first scene. And so she works for the Professor Walgate. I'm assuming she's kind of following him around the entire movie. And he's a retired scientist living near the base. So I'm not sure why I'm not really, maybe I missed something about why she was with him so much, but anyway, in any regard, she is with him. And so that's how we meet Barbara and Professor Walgate. And of course, the main character who's Major Cummings, played by Marshall Thompson, Jeff Cummings. And so he's our main hero, I guess you'd call it, and kind of the one looking into everything. So there's a U.S. Air Force Interceptor Command experimental station, I guess is what it is, number 6. It's a long-range radar installation, and that's located where they are in Canada. And so there's these unexplained deaths that start to occur, and the Major is looking into everything, and eventually, it actually starts to happen off the base. There's an older couple on a farm just outside the base, and they are attacked in a scene. And now at this point, we still don't see, we talked about monsters being off screen and creatures being off screen and things like that. This movie takes it a step further, where the monsters are actually invisible in the beginning. We don't see anything. You just see little things like a bucket will get tipped over, and you'll see footsteps maybe in certain ground areas and things like that. But that's all you see. And I found this effect pretty I thought creepy and kind of cool, actually, like an Invisible Man type thing, which I don't know exactly if this was done for budgetary reasons or not, but if it was, it was kind of genius. And even if it wasn't, it's still interesting.
It's very effective. It's totally believable. The way that they did it, it's just subtle enough, where you can really pick up on it. You can really kind of tell what's happening, but it's not so heavy handed. They're not really like showing off the effect. They're kind of using it in a very focused, practical way, and for me, it worked really well.
Yeah, it was exactly the right amount of that type of stuff, because you could go overboard with that kind of thing and have things flying around and but it was actually done pretty tastefully, I thought, and very restrained. So this older couple on a farm is killed, and that's when things really start to ramp up, and the resident medical professional, Dr. Warren, does an autopsy, and this reveals that both the brain and the spinal cord of the victims have been sucked out of them, quote unquote, sucked out of them, and also quote unquote mental vampire. This is what they deduce. I really love that term, mental vampire. Never heard that before. And I also like there being some sort of supernatural explanation, kind of. This is a little different, I think, to what we've seen so far.
It's not just there's some kind of radiation going on. It's a little bit,
There's something else.
There's something else, yeah.
And they can't quite put their finger on it because it's not exactly physical, what's happening. So we go on from there, and eventually Major Cummings is doing some snooping around in Professor Walgate's office, and he finds this book, which I don't know, I found it kind of funny. Like, I actually laughed when I saw it for some reason. But the book's just called The Principles of Thought Control by Professor R.E. Walgate. It's just like right there on the cover. And it's like, okay. Oh. And then there's some great punching action as he's confronted by Miss Grizel's boyfriend.
Yeah. Wonderful punching, really.
Gibbons. Yeah, some good punching. His name's Gibbons. And so they get into a little tussle there. And eventually her boyfriend leads a posse to hunt down whomever or whatever is murdering people. And we have another talk with the professor later on, and we find out that while Major Cummings was suspicious of him, he's not completely at fault here. He didn't really cause this intentionally, but the long and the short of it is that he created a situation, an accident pretty much, where this was able to occur, where these beings were able to take form, or not take form, I guess, but it come into being.
They became separate of the experiment.
Of the experiment, right. And this is due to radiation. The professor believes that there may be a link to the radar or radiation on the base, and these creatures that have come into being. So they have a discussion, trying to figure out the best course of action. They hear someone moaning. It actually sounded kind of like a zombie. There was like a zombie-like moaning, and then Gibbons appears, and he's like a shell of a man. Like he has sans brain and I guess spine, although he seems to be walking upright. And so they have this little attack scene with him, which is kind of cool. It was like a zombie scene, I guess. And then like I said, the scientist finally admits that he's not only succeeded in developing this mental ability that he was trying to create, but in the process, he created a living thought projection, which is essentially what these beings are. Although unknown to him, the nuclear power, I guess, experiments, they had an adverse effect on this and actually enhanced the mental abilities of these creatures, and that's what they're dealing with here. And he actually calls it a new form of life. So it's sort of like an evil entity, I guess. So pretty wild plot. I mean, it's and this is before we even get to the brains and the spinal cords that we can actually see, and they become animated, quite literally. Yeah. So it's already pretty crazy at this point, but then we see a brain, and then we see many brains, and they have antennae on their heads. They're like little alien brains almost, or insect brains, I guess. And again, spinal cords. It's really crazy. So, and they're in these trees, and they start crawling down the trees, kind of snake-like or caterpillar-like, and they start to become physical as they get more powerful. It's like they start to come into being, and it was pretty disturbing and pretty cool. I thought.
Yeah, it's a pretty freaky effect. As we mentioned before, the effects in this movie are really, really strong for this era.
And it amps up here because now they have the stop animation, which,
Yeah.
not every movie at this time was able to have that because they couldn't afford it. So
Yeah.
they had some budget they were working with here, I guess. Or
Well, and even the ones that could wouldn't necessarily do it this well. This film, like these things are really, really kind of feel lifelike. Like the movements. There was a lot of detail put in. And clearly a lot of thought put into how these things would move. It wasn't just, we're gonna do some stop motion animation, so they're not totally still. It's like they arched in the same way, like
life
they
of
bend.
their own. Yeah,
yeah, like they bend like a spine would bend. They're kind of like they pulse a little bit. The brains it kind of feels like the brain waves or whatever. It's like they're expanding and contracting. It's not just simple motion for the sake of it's alive. It really feels like almost like the people who did the stop motion animation observed maybe caterpillars, like you mentioned, or kind of a combination of a few animals, really looking at naturalistic movement and did a pretty unbelievable job. The other thing that I noticed too that was really cool with the stop motion animation is that I think I'm not totally sure how they achieved the effect. I'm thinking maybe it was some kind of split screen where the split was hidden. But for example, when the brains are in the trees, there's one point where there are leaves falling next to the fiends, for lack of a better term, and the leaves are falling totally naturalistically. They're not animated. So it really gave this feeling of realism because it felt like they were moving and interacting in a real space. You didn't see like the normal kind of flickers of light in the corners of frames that you might see with stop motion. Like this was really carefully, professionally done work.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive, these special effects. And like you said, Jeremy, really well done. A lot of attention to detail. They are definitely creepy, these things that are kind of crawling around. And there's just the wide range of effects in this movie I was very impressed by. We talked about how in the beginning the creatures are they are invisible, so we don't see anything, but there's the manipulation of scenery, like we said, the bucket being tipped over, there's a carpet that bunches up, and then this is also mixed with a little bit of stop animation or stop motion, because at one point there's something moving through this liquid from the bucket, and you see footsteps, but obviously these are done, through trickery. They're not, they weren't done on set or anything like that. Or they weren't done, at the time, like they were kind of filmed one at a time. You can tell that, so there's that sort of trickery going on. And then from there, there's the invisible beings are choking people, pulling them through windows. And then from there, we go to these stop motion creatures for the crawling brains and spines, which is still crazy. And then from there, because these creatures start to attack, we see bloody exploding gore, which I was really not prepared for.
Yeah.
When the characters shoot these creatures, they explode, and I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah,
especially for the time, you didn't really see many effects like that.
No, this is definitely of all of the films that kind of fit into this genre that we're doing this series on. This is definitely the most kind of violent and disturbing. You really don't see that. They normally at that time, and maybe once again that comes back to the fact that it is a European film, and maybe they weren't quite as worried about. Because it wasn't really a B movie per se, they didn't have to worry necessarily as much about getting this onto a bill in the United States, because they knew that maybe they could be successful at home where things were a little more relaxed. But yeah, they really took it pretty far.
Yeah, and I was reading before I had even watched the movie a little bit about it, and I'd read that there was an uproar in the public about this film and about the violence and how extreme it was, and they were going to give it the, of course, fatal X rating.
Yeah.
Which is pretty extreme, especially back then. So I was wondering, where do imaginary creatures get so violent? And but when we got to that moment, I was like, okay, I actually understand. Like for that time, that was pretty crazy.
It's disturbing to look at now. It looks pretty real.
It does, yeah. It's really well done, and this is before we had gotten to Night of the Living Dead and those types of movies where we were starting to get more used to seeing these kinds of effects. So, so I thought that was pretty ballsy, pretty creative too. Pretty crazy that they did that. So just to wrap up this little short summary of the movie. So As I mentioned, much like in them, these creatures are emitting these disturbing noises, and that noise comes back in the scene in full force, and the characters try to fight them off and shoot them, and that's when we get that blood and gore squibs or whatever they were effects that were coming out. And the characters need to stop the radiation that's feeding these creatures. So they decide their plan is to blow up the control room, and very smart, these brains. They reach through boarded up windows. Yeah, they're brains, I guess. But yeah, they reach through. They have these windows that are boarded up, and they steal a hammer and they try to get inside and pry their way in. And one of them flies at Barbara's head. It was pretty crazy. So that scene's great when they come into the room, and a lot of violence and destruction there. And once in the control room, Major Cummings is able to. He once he reaches it, he detonates the bomb, and the brains sort of just die. They kind of just fall out of the trees and onto the ground and onto the floor, and they disintegrate. And that was another cool effect too there when the brains disintegrated. Yeah, that's in a nutshell. That's pretty much the movie. Pretty much ends
simple,
there. Yeah, pretty much once they kill all the brains and spinal cords, the movie's over. Which like we said,
where are you gonna go from there? Once you kill the
go
brains.
in and out. Yeah, once you kill the monsters, that's pretty much it. So, yeah, that is Fiend Without a Face. So pretty crazy movie. Crazy that it's in the Criterion Collection, kind of. Although I feel like I feel like it makes sense in a certain way.
It makes sense,
I feel like, yeah. And just because it is so out there and so different. And sort of avant-garde in a kind of way. I mean, it's pretty conventional as these types of movies go, but on the other hand, it is, there's some ideas there that are different and kind of make you think a little bit, which is cool.
Yeah. Well, I think that the monster is kind of an abstraction. The monster is such an abstract idea. Like they didn't, I guess they did explain the science in this movie. Kind
they
of.
did a little bit,
but
not too much.
Yeah, but I feel like with a lot of these other films, they really spend a lot of time really trying to get into the science of it. Trying to kind of justify how they got there. And this one, even though there is an explanation of the science, it doesn't really feel like that's what they were worried about as much. It felt like they were kind of more worried about this idea of something, kind of the combination of the human mind and science, and how that's really what's dangerous. And that we don't necessarily totally have to even understand what we're creating for it to be dangerous, and that the thought process is really the most dangerous thing at the end of the day. Yeah.
I mean, it's more of a complicated plot, I would say, than the other ones that we watch. But also, it's like you said, they don't explain too much. They kind of explain just enough to get around things, which is fine. You don't need to spend the whole movie explaining things. So I was fine with that. It gives you just enough to kind of get the lay of the land and kind of understand what's going on. But I think at the end of the day, it was just a way to have a different type of movie monster, a different type of creature, I guess. But this one was, it's memorable just because it is so out there and so abstract. So, I think it stands out in our list of movies here. Although the one coming up next, The Blob, is pretty damn strange too. So, but
although a little bit better known. Might not seem as strange to people because people know the Blob.
Exactly.
But this one,
there's just something about right, and there's just something about a brain and a spinal cord that it's so unnatural to see that moving around on its own without any skin over it.
It's kind of cringy and
it's something. Yeah,
it almost made me think of I don't know, Mark, have you seen the movie Akira?
Yeah.
It almost made me think of like this is kind of body horror, kind of like early body horror, but different than your normal body horror, because normal body horror, the horror involves some body, it involves an individual and something happening to their body. Yeah. Whereas this one, I mean, I guess the idea of someone having their brain and spinal cord sucked out is something happening to somebody, but we're not seeing the process. It's not something that kind of happens over time where there's like a slow change. It kind of happens so quick that like the people don't even, we see them kind of, grimace or whatever, but it seems like they die so fast that it's almost like they don't even know what hit them. And the horror is the body existing, parts of the body existing without a body.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty, even now, a pretty surprising take on the body horror genre.
It's funny when you say the word body horror, you can't hear that without thinking of Cronenberg. The
Yeah,
director,
Cronenberg. Yeah.
David Cronenberg. But you're right, Jeremy. I mean, this is so much. While his movies deal with so many horrific images, nothing like this, though. I mean, this is totally in its own element, I would say, because it's, like you said, it doesn't actually involve a body or skin or anything like that. It just involves the inside, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And kind of fascinating. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely take if you haven't already watched this, definitely check it out. I would say it gets a pretty big recommendation from us, and I'm really glad you recommended this too, Jeremy, for the series, because I may have come across it at some point, but I'm glad I watched it when I did.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those movies that kind of is known only by people who are pretty into this kind of movie. It's not the kind of thing that you're going to come across a video essay on necessarily. There might be one out there. I can't say that confidently, but most likely it's not the kind of thing that's like studied all the time. It's not the kind of movie that really gets talked about a lot. But it does seem like it's kind of a weird outlier in this genre that is so famous and produced some movies and so much kind of parody. It just finds this really interesting place. One thing I would note, though, the movie that kept popping into my mind, and interestingly, I didn't even really see it the first time, but this time watching it again, I kept thinking about the movie Eraserhead, which, and I feel like there's this weird pattern, I don't even want to say pattern, but just on this podcast here, where I feel like every time we do a series, I start to see where David Lynch comes from a little bit. In a weird way, because he's one of those kind of directors who's just a total enigma, and it almost seems like he just, almost like These Brains, was just a weird thought experiment that went awry, and suddenly there were movies being made. So for me personally, I'm a big fan of his work. He's definitely one of the people who, and Mark, I know you have Eraserhead posters hanging up, and you're a huge fan. So it is cool kind of seeing maybe where some of these cult directors that we've discussed, although we haven't done a Lynch episode specifically yet.
Not yet.
But we should, though. We should, maybe. But it is cool kind of seeing where some of these cult directors who made work after these movies, maybe where they came from, where these people who were working outside of kind of mainstream Hollywood and the very conventional movie structure and images, where maybe they came from and where the influences were, and that they weren't just kind of formed from nothing and just appeared. But, these people are creative people who are watching things and looking at art and absorbing it in the same way any other creative person does. But the influences for them just might come from kind of more specific and surprising places than your average, not that I want to say any director is average, but you're more kind of standard film director.
Yeah, David Lynch, especially if you look at a lot of his work, there's sort of that 50s pastiche, or a lot of elements of his movies kind of harken back to a simpler time, or back, I would say even particularly back to the 50s.
The 50s for sure, yeah.
Yeah, he has that sort of aesthetic for a lot of his films, a lot of his work. So I can definitely see what you're referring to with that.
Particularly, there's one scene in Eraserhead which is really famous, known as the Lady in the Radiator scene, which for any of our listeners who have not seen Eraserhead, if you're a cult movie fan, I highly recommend checking out that film.
Watch it now.
It's kind of might be the quintessential cult film in a weird way.
I think of it as that. Yeah.
But there is one scene in that film where this one character who I would call a woman, but she's kind of also I'm not going to even try to explain Lynch, but there's one scene in particular that uses a very similar kind of imagery, and has a very, the best word I can think of is, has very similar textures to this movie. Very similar textures, which is exciting because you really can kind of see a through line being built.
Well, also just how we describe those creatures, the brain and spinal cord, the way it crawls and kind of ekes along the floor. Yeah, it did remind me of something out of Eraserhead, like the baby, the creature, in that film. And there are some effects in that film that are kind of, there is a little bit of stop motion and things like that. Not too much, but just a little bit.
But it's there,
and it is there, and I can totally see what you're referring to. And I think Lynch probably was pretty impressionable at this time, and he was younger, and I'm sure watching these movies and it was probably making his mind do all kinds of crazy things. Like he probably came up with so many ideas at that time, or maybe if he's even not even conscious of it, now thinking back, or when he made these other films, looking back, he probably was somehow drawing on these types of images. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot on this show. I'm sure it'll come up a decent amount. But if you haven't seen Eraserhead, definitely turn the lights down. Go, maybe by yourself. It's not for everyone. Yeah. But just take a look at it. I mean, if you're into these other movies, you'll probably be into that one.
Particularly if you're into these 1950s movies. If you haven't seen Eraserhead,
it has that kind of vibe.
It has that.
But also,
vibe.
It's just its own thing. It's 70s experimental avant-garde craziness. So it's something. It's one of my favorites. So I'm sure we'll talk about it on the show at some point in depth, because other than that, it's going to get brought up a lot probably. But so that's a good comparison to make, I would say. But other than that, I mean, not too much else to say. Like we said, these shorter movies, sometimes there's not quite as much to dive into, but I think we talked about the main things, the important things about this film. And did you have anything else you wanted to bring up about this one?
Nothing specific, just maybe some kind of favorite moments for me.
Yeah.
And I think this is what a lot of people kind of take away from this one. Is obviously the big scene at the end when they're kind of fighting these brains and spinal cords.
Yeah, that was phenomenal.
Yeah, it's just so cool. Like it's so and especially I think there's this thing, now I think more than ever, as we're getting into streaming being kind of the main way people watch their movies. And Mark and I were talking in a recent episode, but as we're recording this, we're kind of still in the midst of the coronavirus quarantining, so aren't people going out to the movies right now. People are watching movies at home. And as that happens more and more, it becomes this complicated thing where the way that film history is defined is in a transitional period right now, because all of a sudden going from this thing where we maybe have repertory theaters playing these movies constantly, all of a sudden we're looking at an undefined period of time right now where the only way people are getting their films is from streaming services and other things on the internet and television. So it does feel important to kind of look at these kind of offbeat movies that maybe could slip through the cracks.
Yeah. Maybe look back a little bit, to maybe errors that you wouldn't normally dive into.
So it's just a cool experience, just watching this kind of movie that has this weird place.
To see a scene like that, like an action scene with all this gore in a movie that early, something that I didn't expect at all. And I could totally see why this movie is notorious for, having kind of being a little more out there. And I thought it was great. And like I said, it goes on for a little bit too. It's not a very quick scene like I thought it would be. I thought there'd be maybe one gunshot, one explosion of gore, and that was it. But there's a few of those, and it goes on for a little bit. So it's really cool. You can tell the filmmakers were really relishing in these effects and really kind of going full force with it. So I appreciated that and thought it was really cool. So that scene obviously is like the standout scene. There were some other moments though. I thought, even before that, the image of the brains and spinal cords in the tree, just kind of like almost watching the characters through the window, I thought was really creepy and unsettling. Definitely very Lynchian there. Something very Lynchian about that. Very eerie. So that definitely stood out. That image was when I saw that, I just kind of took me back a little bit. So that was really cool. And just those early scenes, like we mentioned with the invisible creatures as well. The one guy gets sucked out the window and things like that. So there's some cool stuff going on there as well. So all around, just really cool short movie to check out if you have a night, one of these quarantine nights, or even if you're not quarantined eventually.
Good movie to watch with the lights turned off.
For sure.
Really just, I mean, all these movies definitely are.
This and Eraserhead would actually be a good,
that would be a tremendous double bill, actually.
Yeah.
That'd be a great, make it happen. I don't know how we do
a creepy night in, but a good night
creepy night in, but this is definitely one, there's some movies that are a little more campy that you can kind of, they're fun to watch with friends, and this one would be fun to watch with friends, but I also feel like this one would be a great one to just kind of let yourself just get totally lost in the weirdness of it. Just totally.
That's what I did.
Yeah, let yourself go. So. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely check it out. So as we mentioned, next time we are going to go into sort of a similar territory with a much larger film, as you mentioned, Jeremy. This one is iconic. Like we started with Godzilla, which was definitely a hugely iconic movie in this genre, and we are going to end with one just as big, if not bigger. Maybe not bigger. just as big. The Blob from 1958. So the same year as this film that we just talked about, Fiend Without a Face, and the film before that, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. So it was a busy year. Lots
Very
of
busy.
creativity, lots of cranking out of these types of movies, and there are some great ones that we're talking about. So really looking forward to talk about the original Blob, The Blob.
The Blob.
Yes, sorry, had to get that right. So yeah, that's going to be a great one. Looking forward to that a lot. And thank you very much for listening to this episode of Cult Movie Cult. And you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to officially join the cult and be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.